Hello, I'm Robin Vincent and welcome to Molten Modular and this part 3 of my enormous investigation into how on earth you write a track on Eurorack. In part 1 I asked the question and we looked at the question from a position of not having the first clue as to what to do. So we examined the question, looked at it, pulled it apart, what does the question mean, and then I opened it up to you people out there to throw in some kind of suggestions as to how to move forward in writing a track, because I had to write a track. If you're starting with part 3, then you need to know that I was asked to write a track to contribute a piece of modular music to the new Modularism CD, which is awesome, and I was absolutely bowled over with the idea, and so it forced me into narrowing my focus down into actually writing a bleeding track of modular music. And so I've been asking this question and going through it. And in part 1, that's what I did. We asked a question. We unpacked the box to see what the question meant and what possible avenues there could be. In part 2, I sort of went back through the question and pointed out a few of the things that I'd learnt, a couple of extra modules that I got just to sort of tidy my rack off in order to put me in a position where I felt I could actually begin writing that track. I had no time. I was left with just a handful of days in order to do that, and that made it somehow doubly, triply, quadruply exciting. And so we find ourselves at this final part, part 3, in which I just kind of wanted to talk through what it was that I did in the end, just to show you how I approached it, some things that I did that I got to work that were vital in what I was trying to do and what I produced, in the hope that some of this is going to be helpful to other people out there also trying to write tracks on Eurorack. What I absolutely should point out right at the start, right now, is that there is no right way of doing this. What I did was just what I did. If it's not written in stone, it's not the most approved or best way of doing anything. I don't know, I'm just making this up as I go. And you will find in the comments below the other 2 videos certainly, and hopefully this one as well, tons and tons of really, really good advice on how to write with modular. I mean, everything from just plug it in, man, and go with it, to sampling lots of different things, slicing up at your door and rearranging it and sticking it into a sampler and then triggering that back. And everything in between. You perform it, or you sculpt it, or you do one thing at a time. You do everything at a time. You do it all at once. You do it in a single take. You do it in multiple takes. There's no end to the ways that you can develop music out of these sorts of machines. But I found my way. I did it. I wrote a track. I wrote a few tracks, actually. But more importantly, I wrote a track that I felt I could contribute to this album, and I've sent it off, and it's gone. And of course, I've since rewired this. In fact, I've even changed modules around, so there's no way I could ever reproduce it. And that is one of those awesome things about Eurorack, is that the tracks that I wrote and I recorded, they are recorded, and that's it. I can't go back and redo it. It is done, it is forgotten, and I've now moved on. That's amazing. It's an amazing thing about using the machine to write the music, rather than writing it all from a DAW or having this huge sort of hardware sequencer which you've saved and got everything running again that you can then put back into it. No, it was done in this box, in this thing here. And as soon as it's gone, it's gone. I can save sequences and bits and pieces, but I'm not very good or conscientious at doing that. And so it tends to be that when it's done and it's unplugged, it's gone. And I'm fine with that. I am embracing that as a musical idea, as a way of moving through my own landscape of music making. I've totally embraced that. And I kind of think it's awesome. So let's start with my approach then. How did I approach this whole idea? Well, for me, what worked for me, without overcomplicating everything, was just to perform it. So I had 4 or 5 goes at this. I had like 4 or 5 days. So I'd sit down and I would just start playing. I'd craft some kind of of patch, and I would work on that for a bit, and I'd work on it a bit more. I'd add some more stuff in. I mean, inevitably, I seemed to keep going until I had absolutely everything plugged in and I'd run out of cables. That seemed to be the point that I stopped. But up until then, I was just, creating sounds, things that layered nicely with each other, all going all at once. And then once I felt I was kind of happy with it, I would hit record on my Surface over here. I would set a stopwatch running because I knew it couldn't be any more than 6 minutes long, and there's no point in me trying to do a 15-minute thing because that wasn't going to work. It needed to be 6 minutes. It needed to be quite snappy. So I set a stopwatch going and hit record, and then I would just start to play, and I would move things around and adjust stuff, move things up and down, twiddle knobs, pretend I was doing something like DJs do, and just see what happened. And after 6 minutes, I'd hit stop, or I'd leave it running more often, reset the stopwatch, give it another go, and then give it another go. 4 or 5 takes seemed to be what felt right to me, and to the point where, well, there's not a whole lot of other different things I could necessarily be doing here, and so perhaps it's time to move on. And once I'd done that, I'd pulled everything out, and it was gone, and then I'd start again, come back to it, start working up a patch, fiddling around, working on the sequences for a bit, working on how I put those together, working on those key changes I was talking about, all that sort of stuff, just working, putting sound out, changing things around, changing the rhythm, the speed, the tempo, until I got something that I quite liked, and then I'd push that further again. I'd set the stopwatch, I'd hit record, and I would perform. I'd move the filter like you do, drop things in and out, that kind of stuff. Do that 4 or 5 times. And then go away. Then come back the next day, put everything out, start again. That was my method. That was the way I did it. It was a matter of working up a sound, working up a patch, developing it, working with it, everything going all at once, and then recording it. That was a plan. If that's a plan, that was what my plan was. Now, the way I recorded was I've recorded in 8 tracks into my Surface, into my DAW, over here. Cubase, as it happens. There was no real reason for using any particular DAW. I just wanted to record pure raw audio. And so I just set up Cubase as an 8-track recorder, because I'm recording through, I've got a Behringer ADAT converter down here, which takes 8 signals out through my audio fuse, audio interface, ADAT input into 8 channels into Cubase. That was the physicality of it. Now, that was interesting in itself, because I knew what I would be doing down the line is a bit of mixing in the DAW itself. I wasn't just going to record it as a stereo output and then say, whoop, there you go. I was going to record it as 8 channels into Cubase, so I could then adjust levels and panning and make a few edits if necessary, or at least give myself the opportunity to do that, give myself the space to do that. But what that meant is that I had 8 channels of sound coming out of this at all times. I mean, I'll take it from different places. I might take it directly from the Veils, I might take it from the Rosie certainly had an output, because I've got a little sub mixer here for the percussion side of things. So those 8 channels would come from different places, sometimes from the Moog over here or the No Coast. But what all that meant was that I didn't really have good level control during the performance. So kind of everything was running at once. There was a certain amount I could do. I mean, I could adjust how intense things were, and I could unplug things, as I did a couple of times. And there are I could turn down little bits on the little mixer over here, but ultimately stuff was coming out that I didn't really have a great deal of level control over, certainly no mute control in order to sort of drop things out in a performance and bring them back in. So usually everything was happening at once, which wasn't always helpful, because there were bits that I missed. I didn't realize something was going on that I'd hear back later in the mix, or I wasn't able to sort of pull out the performance that I wanted because I couldn't turn off different channels as I was going. So that wasn't a disaster by any means, because I knew what I was attempting to do, and I knew getting those 8 tracks out was important because it gave me more power later on. But at the same time, it did hamper me a little bit in that some of the sort of the nuance, I suppose, was lost within all of those 8 channels sounding all at once all the time. But ultimately that seemed, to my mind, to give me the best combination of a performed piece and some post-production possibilities. Now we'll get to the tracks and the editing and the stuff that I did in the DAW in a little bit. We'll get to that. So you will hear some snippets of what it was that I created. But before then, I just wanted to point out which bits and which modules were completely essential to what I was attempting to do, so that there is a certain amount of intentionality in this. Oh yes, I did do things on purpose. It wasn't all just found and accidental and stumbled into. I did have an idea, and I did have a couple of things that I wanted to try to achieve. Whether I accomplished that or not, I have no idea. But here's just a couple of things that I thought you might find interesting. So there were a couple of things that I wanted to do. I wanted to use kind of intervals in order to create sort of thicker sound so that everything's not playing the same note. They might be playing the same tune, but they're playing it an interval apart. And the other thing I wanted to bring in was the ability to transpose, to change key or to move from one chord essentially to another. And it's pretty easy to show you how I accomplished that by just building up a very quick patch. So what I did is that I used the microscale. Now the microscale is a IntelliGel quantizer, and its particular superpower is that it has two outputs that you can set apart by an interval. So rather than just having one tune coming out, you can have a tune set an interval below. What does that sound like? A bit like this. So let's plug that in from the microscale into there. Take a sequence out of my variegate, plug that in there. So that's super. Now out of the second output, I've set it up as to be an interval, so that actually plays a different bunch of notes. Lovely. So instead of swapping that cable, why don't I have two oscillators playing together to create an interval? Now I should point out here that there's one thing that I did discover in all of this, and that is the tuning of oscillators. Yeah, it's not something I'd really thought about before because, I don't know, I'm just bumble on through as to what I'm doing. But it suddenly occurred to me that actually tuning the oscillators is extremely useful. Now I did attempt to use the Disting 4 here because it has a tuner built in, and plug them all into that and try to tune it. Or either you don't tune the Disting, you tune the oscillator so it came up showing the same sort of note. I tried that and it didn't really work for me. I don't know what it was, it just wasn't quite right. So I ended up tuning everything by ear, by hand, just hearing it and then adjusting things a little bit. So I have no idea whether it was in concert pitch or in any sort of pitch, really. I just made sure that they sounded about right relative to each other. There's probably better ways to do that, but I feel completely fine about that. Anyway, so let's also plug in the wavetable synth over here. I'll stick that in there, and I will feed that the second output from the microscale, so that we should then get a nice kind of dual thing going on. There you go. That's lovely. So that's a fantastic feature of the microscale. It allows me to set up two notes an interval apart and play them with the same sequence. Fantastic. So the next thing I wanted to do was transpose that sequence. Now you can do that by fiddling around with the buttons in the microscale, but you can probably do it better using its shift input here. Now what I need is some kind of CV source in order to change that about. So I'm going to use output 3 on the maths, which is this knob here, which gives me CV, I've discovered. So I'm going to stick that in there. Now that's one way of doing it. There's another way, which is I could apply the CV, or mix the CV rather, directly with the sequence from the variegate. So rather than shifting the root note on the microscale, I could shift the sequence itself. And I can't remember whether that's easier or harder, but I seemed to prefer to do it that way. So if I take my sequence from my variegate, plug that into my mixer at the top here, I can then take the same signal out back into the microscale, take the shift out for the moment, and I will have the original sequence back going away. And funny enough, just by changing the volume knob on the little mixer here, I am changing the octave of the sequence. See, that's the interesting thing about Eurorack. There's always more ways of doing something than you realise. And sometimes you overcomplicate things when you don't need to. I don't know, I'm just going to keep plumbing on with what I did, regardless if there's simpler ways to do it. So now I'm going to take the output of the maths, number 3, plug that into the second channel on the mixer. So now I can mix those two signals together. So that's simple. I've just got a sequence, I'm adding some CV from here, and that's changing the range of notes. Simple. So is there a way that I can get that to happen automatically? So rather than me having to twist that knob, because I'm probably going to have other things to be doing within my performance, like moving filter knobs, that's what we like to do. So what would be really cool would be if I can get that to happen by itself. Now that is exactly the reason why I bought the sequential switch, this Doepfer A151 sequential switch. What that does is it switches through some various output input things and then changes the output input thing of the output input thing. I find it quite difficult to explain, probably easier to show, because every time I try to use a sequential switch, it kind of melts my brain a little bit. And then I go, oh yeah, no, this is how it works. So I'm just going to have to attempt to do it, and then hopefully my explanation will become clear. So the first thing it needs is a clock. So I'll take my clock out from the very gate, plug that in to the top. Now what happens is that the sequential switch, in response to that clock, steps through these 4 channels here. And these can either be inputs or outputs. Doesn't seem to matter. And what I want to do, I want to be able to run my sequence without the additional CV and then run it with it, and then swap between the two. So as you can see, these two swapping here, I mean, it can go to all 4 steps if that's what I want, but I only actually need 2 things to happen. I want it to be off and I want it to be on. And that's going step, 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 there. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to use this switch to introduce the CV coming from maths. So I need to plug the CV from maths into channel 2 on here. So I want channel 1 for it to not happen and channel 2 to introduce the CV. So currently, when it's on channel 1, when it's on step 1, if you like, it's not got any additional input. So the output is going to be of nothing. So I can plug that into my mixer where the maths used to be, and that'll have, hopefully, no effect whatsoever when it's on step 1. When it's on step 2, it will take whatever's coming from the maths and output that through this cable into the mixer. See, it hurts my brain somehow, but I do fully understand it. I've just had to sit here for 2 minutes and tell myself how it works in order to get that to work. At the moment, you're just getting that high pitch at the end because this is all moving far too fast. That's no good. That's not what I want. I want it to move every run of the sequence, or every 2 sequences, every bar, every 2 bars, every 4 bars, whatever it is that I want. At the moment, this is all running far too fast. So what do I do about that? Well, the other purchase that I had, which I also felt was vital for everything that I was doing, was a clock divider, this Doepfer A160 here. And this is essential for calming down the timing of your rack, because something is giving you a clock. Often your sequencer, could be an LFO, could be all sorts of things. You've got a clock from somewhere, but if everything's running at the same time, everything gets a little bit intense and crazy and is all following the same kind of beat very, very precisely. And it prevents you from getting either really long notes or really short notes or a variation, because variation is what you need. A clock divider will give you that. So rather than having the clock go into the sequential switch, I'll put that into my clock divider here. Now the clock divider is brilliant. It just divides clock. So you've got a clock happening here, and then you've got one that's going half as fast, and then a quarter as fast, and then so on and so forth. So the one at the bottom here hardly ever lights up. All it really means is that I'm getting slower clocks compared to the original one out of there. So if I take a slower clock, say if I take the 4331 here, I don't really know what any of those numbers mean. I haven't looked into it yet. I'm just feeling my way through. Stick that in the top. Now the change. Still not quite enough. I'm now going sort of about half a bar. So halfway through the sequence, it then flips. So I put it into the next one. So you can hear now I've got two chords going on. It changes up, and then it changes down a little bit. If I adjust the amount it's getting, that will change. You know, I can make the clock even longer, so I get kind of 2 bars of each. Like so. It's simple, but enormously clever and enormously helpful. And I'm just using 2 steps. So 1 step with it off, another step with it on. So I'm introducing this variation straight away. If I had 3 steps going or 4 steps going, I could add in other CV steps and have it change to something else or change differently or to add something else in. I've only really begun to scratch the surface with the sequential switch, and I'm quite excited about getting to grips with it a bit more, because I think there's an awful lot you can do with it. Just want to talk about another module, which is the Vermona randomRHYTHM. Now Vermona sent me this in order to do a review. It should hopefully be the next video that I do. And the reason I want to talk about it is because it very, very quickly became the absolute beating heart of my Eurorack performance. It has so many little elements into it that can control so many different things that it's become one of the most useful modules in my rack. What do I mean? Well, essentially it becomes the gate and rhythm section of the whole thing, but not just for percussion. It does percussion very well, but not just for that. It's also the gating that it does. It allows you to add all sorts of rhythmic flavor in all sorts of different places. It's very, very interesting. And you have the ability to, well, first of all, randomize it, but also increase and decrease the intensity of that. And it's that which gives you this performance aspect. So you can pull it back and then intensify it again very quickly, very easily. Let me show you what I mean with this little sequence going. We're just going to use that and the randomRHYTHM and start to play with it. Maybe introduce a couple of other elements. Let's see. So the randomRHYTHM essentially is 2 lots of a 4-channel beat machine. No, rhythm thing, I don't know. You've got quarter notes, 1/8 notes, 16 notes, and triplets. And each one of these sliders governs how often and how quickly that happens. So if I take my quarter note, for instance, I can plug that into the maths to start triggering that off. There we go. So let's take another output. Let's take, say, the 16ths, and I'm going to plug that into the other part of maths over here. So those 2 bits here are already triggering the envelopes on my lovely sequence. Now I can change the intensity of those just by moving the sliders around. If I want that first one to run a bit more often, I can put it into the 8th. Now the probability, there's all sorts of probability built into here, into how things trigger. And if I hit the dice button, that will change that pattern. And then I can move it back down in order to reduce the intensity. Let's take a quarter note, stick that in to some drums over here. It also has another output, which is like a combined output. It's called sequencer output, and I can take that, and that takes the combination of all of those triggers, and I can stick that into a hi-hat, for instance. So yeah, it's a totally fascinating little module. I love the swing. Swing is just superb. Oh yeah, you see? So there's one other thing that I used that I thought was interesting, only because it's a little bit new and worth pointing out, and that was the Graphic VCO. I use that a lot. It's a new Erica Synths wavetable oscillator, which has got a whole stack of wavetables inside that you can morph from one to the other, you know, really interestingly and nicely. And a lot of other crazy stuff going on inside that I didn't really get into massively. All I really wanted was a sound that moved, but the little hidden gem inside the Graphic VCO is its sub bass. Let me see if I can show you. So I've now got the Graphic VCO playing. It's just playing its standard basic sort of sine wave thing. And you've got two outputs. You've got your regular output, and then you've got the output 2, which is the sub output. And at the moment they're an octave apart, like you'd normally expect to find on a sub. But I'm going to bring you in and show you what's interesting about the sub. So in the Graphic VCO, you've got this lovely sort of menu thing going on, and you can go to sub there. And you can see they have this offset set to 12 semitones. Now what's interesting about that is that you can change that. So you suddenly have this sort of little two-voice synth going on. And of course it gets more interesting if I use more interesting sounds. Let's come out of that, change the mode to, I like the Matrix thing. If I go back to the sub, so it can either be a copy of what's currently selected as a wavetable, or it could be a sine, a triangle, a pulse. So yeah, that was really interesting. So I had both the ability to set up an interval on the microscale for a couple of oscillators, or I could set the interval on the Graphic VCO and use that all by itself as kind of two notes going on. And they can be two different sounding notes, more importantly. So rather than just having a normal sub, which is typically a square wave, you had choice and movement over that. And while you've got, you know, the morphing going on at the top, you can have something else going on underneath. And also, because they have individual outputs, you can adjust how they are being sounded, how they are being gated and triggered. Now, I don't think there was anything else particularly clever or inspirational that I did. Everything else was just wiring it together, sticking stuff into it, more stuff and more stuff, using filters, not using filters, trying to come up with something interesting, moving the tempo around until I found something that I liked. And all of it, as I say, within a box. Now, I confess that I used my BeatStep Pro once. I did use it once. Now, the reason being was because I just wanted one more sound. I wanted something to go bing every now and again as the song looped around. I just needed a bing. And it was really hard to make that happen in something like the Variegate. I couldn't seem to get a way just to trigger one single note like that, because you need to combine not only a pitch, but you need to combine a gate and put all that together, and then you need a VCA and an envelope. And anyway, it was just getting a little bit tricky. And so I brought the BeatStep Pro in just in order to send one note every now and again. And that's what I did, and that worked beautifully. And in some ways that makes me think I kind of need to hang on to that just for those sorts of situations, that actually it might be good if you just want to introduce something every now and again. The other thing I used in a very similar situation was the Her mod here. Squarp Instruments have very kindly sent me a Her mod to try out. Now, it's kind of a massive thing, and in many ways not really what I want in my rack. However, I'm certainly up for giving it a really good look. But what I used it for was a very similar thing to BeatStep Pro. I just wanted to send a couple of notes going around, and this was there. I'd ran out of everything else that I could do, and so I just sort of plugged it in. I moved a few things and found a note. Oh yeah, and you do that. Oh yeah, and you do that. And it just sent out this very simple 2-note sequence. So I used that and wired that in. So those were two kind of more intentional things that I did. Otherwise, I was just putting sound out of wherever it was that I found it. So the next thing we need to worry about is that once we've faffed around and done our actual performances, what happens next? What then happens? Well, that's what we're going to look at now. So let's have a little noodle into the post-production side then. With this, I definitely wanted to bring a light touch. I didn't want to spend a whole load of time stuck on my computer, stuck in a DAW, trying to work out what the heck I was going to do with all of this. I wanted some basic mixing facilities. I wanted to be able to change levels. I wanted to mute some stuff in and out if that seemed necessary or helpful. And I wanted to pan. Some panning is really good because, you know, modules that pan in Eurorack, they take up a whole load of space and are expensive. So that's not something I particularly want to invest in. So I can do that in post-production after the event. So here's what I did. I mean, first of all, everything was recorded onto my Surface over there by the rack. I mean, I sort of went into that in a lot more detail in some of the other parts of this video, so I'm not going to go over it again now. Suffice to say, I had 8 channels of audio going into the Surface. Then all I did was I put that recorded audio onto a USB thumb drive, brought it over to my desktop computer here, and I've now imported them all into Bitwig. Now, the reason for using Bitwig was because I thought I could use some of their really interesting LFO and modulation devices to add other sort of modular style mixing and effects to what I was doing. But in the end, I didn't really use any of that at all. So you could use any DAW. So I've got 8 channels of stuff on different takes. If I calm this down a little bit for you, I can show you, because I've folderized them, because I am that clever. So I stuck on here all of my takes from the first session that I did, and then I've got 2 alternative takes here which I did at a slightly different tempo, I think, if memory serves. Then I did another session. I've got 4 takes from that, another session, another 4 takes, and the final session where I've got 5 takes. That's all my raw material. So out of that, for the 20 takes or so, I have to find, or I had to find, the track that I was going to release on a proper CD, like. No pressure then. So each one of these folders contains my 8 channels of audio. As I say, these have been messed about a little bit because this is just my initially saved project, just to show you that difference. And I've managed to pull out what each of these tracks was. So I've got a delayed bloop, I've called it, a second delayed bloop, I've got bass, I've got something which was a bit harsh, some other bloop, a long moogie sound, the bass simulus, and some drums. Sounds a bit like this. Bet you weren't expecting that, were you? So that was my first take at something. And at this point, I really had no idea what I was doing. But it got better. As it went along, I developed the patch that I was using and then did another take. Now, it doesn't sound anything like the first one, but it was developed from it. I sort of started the first day at attacking this with this just mess, this cacophony, which was like, I don't know, I'm just this and this. And yet somehow, along the line, I went from something that sounds like this to this. I mean, this track is all about the Turing machine. I've got the Turing machine driving two melodies set apart by an interval like I showed you earlier, and that kind of formed the basis of what was going on. That was all going on, and I just started to build things underneath. But it did develop from one thing into another quite remarkably. But that's the beauty of working with Eurorack. You're not preset surfing. You're not trying to find a sound in that regard. You're trying to sculpt a sound, sculpt an environment, a soundscape, a feeling, an emotion somehow into these modules and these bits and pieces. And that's why it gets me every time. That's why I find this whole thing so exciting, is that you can absolutely go from rubbish up to something half decent and probably back again. But it's developing all the time. And you're not sort of deleting bars and then redoing them. You're evolving it, you're moving it, you're unplugging things that aren't quite working and plugging into other things. It's really interesting how it develops. And so I then ended up doing about 3 different takes of the same sort of performance. So the same kind of sound was being generated, and I had 3 goes at performing it. And in all of that, because it's done live, I mean, I'm manipulating particularly the bassimilus in this instance, in this particular track, I did a lot of twiddling of those knobs and modulation, and so each take comes out slightly differently. And also the points at which I drop the drums out or bring them back in again, that was done live as well. So you can see here, you know, there's the gap where I drop the drums out completely. But you can see that I did that very differently on this other take over here. So, you know, what I'm saying is that each one was individual, each one was different, even though I'm using the same kind of soundscape and the same idea. Each performance has its own merits, and in post, what I'm attempting to do is find the take that seemed to work best somehow. Okay, next, what happens with my second track, that this is actually the same track, but what I wanted to do was to do a proper key change, a proper transposition, which didn't occur in that first track. And so I decided that I'd give that a go within here. There, can you hear that? So that kind of worked. I was using the sequential switch. I was using it over a much longer period, so it didn't do it every other bar. It did it like after 1632 bars or something of that nature. I mean, as it turns out, I didn't really like either of these takes, so I sort of dismissed them quite early on. But then I came back the next day and tried to do something a little bit different. This was a much more sort of ambient piece with sort of noises and throbs and stuff like that going on. Another take on that. Yeah, that one's not working quite so well, is it? But you can also hear the key change in there, the chordal change that I put in, which was working much better, I thought, in this particular track. Now the next day was quite weird. I'd left everything connected the day before. I'd come back in and I sort of fiddled with it a bit because I really liked the previous day's work, the ambient bit. But I wanted to start something new. But as I fiddled with it, I sort of stumbled upon this kind of this beat, this vibe, which I really, really liked. And so I started working on that. The sort of chord sound, that sound you can hear, that was the Graphic VCO set up at an interval that was, I think I ran the sequence into it too quickly or something, and it just came up with this really interesting rotating sort of chord, pseudo chord if you like. So that was quite nice. And then I had time for one more. I mean, the time restraints I had were quite extraordinary. I said to myself I had to leave the Monday for the mixing to do this, to do the post-production. So I had to finish recording on Sunday, and that's what I did. I worked to that time scale. I didn't attempt to go beyond it because I really didn't want to put myself in a position where I couldn't deliver a track because I'd ran out of time. So at the end of Sunday, bam, that was it. I was done. And this is what I came up with on the last day. And one of the interesting things in this, or sort of interesting things in this particular take, is that I wanted to do more interesting things with the modulation, because I'm often using LFOs, I'm often using sine waves to smoothly move something from one place to another in a sort of way, which is fine. It's sweeping, it's lovely, but I wanted to do something else. So in this time, I started to combine LFOs. So I got, for instance, the wavetable oscillator. I got modulation going between the wavetable, so I could swap between different waves, and that was morphing from one to another. But I was changing at the same time, modulating the speed that was happening, which gave us this kind of slow change, and then a boom, and then another change. So you should be able to hear that in here. So that's a note which then starts getting quicker and then slows down again. I really quite like that. So I guess behind that was an idea that I just wanted to kind of demonstrate slightly more complex modulation. I mean, you know, not that complex, just a little bit more complex. So those were my takes, my attempts, my performances in their rawest form, and I've not done anything to them in this particular project. So next I decided that, well, I wanted to make them sound that little bit better in post. So I did a little bit of mixing. So at this save point, I've already discounted a bunch of takes, thrown out the ones that I didn't like immediately. I've tidied everything up so everything is the right size and is not being time stretched or squashed or warped in any way. And then I simply went to the 8 channels of mixing for each of these, and I did a little bit of panning. I panned stuff about. So these are my 8 channels here, and I've done a little bit of panning on the beep on that side, and another beep there, going in a similar place. I've got lots of beeps in this one. So anyway, so I panned some beeps hard, left and right, and others slightly a little bit less, just to give it that little bit more space. Now over the top of everything, I put in this reverb, put in a reverb bus using the RC48 from Soft Tube via Native Instruments, which I really like. If I disable that, you'll hear the difference, I imagine. So every channel is sending out to that to one degree or another. And then the other thing I used was a choral effect. This is a chorus. It's a new chorus from Native Instruments that I happened to pick up, and it's really very nice. Now let me show you it on a different channel. So that's the Wavetable Graphic VCO set up as an interval, going a little bit crazy. It just added some wideness and some thickness to it, I felt. Oh yeah, nice chord change there. Did you hear that? Nice, yes. So with the mixing, the adjusting of levels, adjusting of pan, I was able to make a better balance of the sound overall. And up to this point, I hadn't done any actual editing. But then when it came down to the wire, I had to make a decision on what I was going to use. So I got down to it in a little bit more of a messy and aggressive fashion. And as you can see, this is slightly more edited than what we saw before. So I'd cut it down to one take of each. I mean, the first track, I don't know why I've still got 4 takes up there. I can't quite remember, but I think I know which one that I use at the end of the day. The second track, this is the one that I use, this one here. And essentially what I did is that I put in a drop, because that's something I couldn't have done in the live performance quite so well. So I've put that in here. And you can also see that I've put in some fades, fading at the end, fading in at the beginning, and also fade in after this drop again. Just some very simple editing. On this track, on the vibe track, I did very little at all, because it just kind of worked as it was, which is beautiful. I did a little bit of fading in, because sometimes things start off a bit too harsh. There's also something else interesting about that particular track, was that I had this bass note going on that came from the Harmad, the Squarp Instruments thing, and it was just a steady thing happening all the time, but everything else was being run by the randomRHYTHM, which also had a load of swing on. And it's weird because I couldn't work out, or I had no spare clock anything anywhere that I could take and put into the Harmad, and I didn't know how to clock the Harmad anyway, I don't think. So they were just running alongside each other, and the bass note and the percussion goes in and out of sync the whole time, because it's kind of been adjusted by ear, I suppose, and it's just makes it slightly strange, but not in a bad way, in a pleasing way. So I kind of let that go. Yeah, you can hear there that bass note is just slightly off. But then it finds itself again. It's nice, I like it. And then we come to this one. This was the final track that I did, and it ended up being the one that I chose to submit for the CD. It just had, somehow it had the most excitement in it. It sort of pulled a level of smile. I mean, if you could measure music by the width of one's smile when one listens to it, then this certainly was the one that won out. And I keep even now keep flip-flopping between different ones, thinking, well, actually, no, maybe this is, or maybe no, or not. But I think this is the one that won it for me. But once I'd made that decision, once I've decided that that was the one I was going to go for, it was then that I started seeing all of the little flaws. And that was not quite so good. So as you can see, I edited this one a hell of a lot more. I mean, first of all, the STO track here that was going throughout, this was just a little bit that I'd done on the BeatStep Pro. That's all I wanted, just that to happen. But I didn't actually want it to run for the entire track. So I chopped a whole load of it out. So it only runs at a certain point. In fact, it only runs during the key change, which you can almost see as a chorus. But there are a few other points, like down here, where this note was just a little bit distorted. That bass, as it started to come in, as I was filtering it, I had a little bit of trouble with a bit of distortion coming in. So I chopped that one out and dropped some undistorted ones in. I mean, is that cheating? I don't know. Probably not. And then you can see there's a few other bits that I faded in as it went. But possibly the biggest fudge I did in the whole of this was that there's this brilliant thing going on with the Bassimilus. It was sort of weird. I had this percussion thing going on, then I had this glorious idea of sticking an LFO into the pitch. So it was suddenly sort of doing this build from nowhere, which was awesome, but it went all the way up and then it came all the way down again. But the problem was that when it came down, it then ended up being on a note which I couldn't really hear because I had everything going on at once and, you know, performing it and very loudly, and I couldn't really hear this note that was going on, and it was just the wrong note. It was an awful note. So when I came back here to listen to it, I discovered there was whole big passages. If you imagine that the LFO is a slow one, it's going all the way up, and then it goes all the way down, and then it goes all the way up again, that on the down bits it just sounded so awful. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear it being there. So what I had to do was I sort of combined two takes. So I used my previous take, which had a very similar idea with a Bassimilus going on, and I took out some of those bits. Well, I duplicated the track, if you like, and put it beneath, and then put some of the better sounding bits in to replace the bits that sounded awful. So if I play you the original bit that was in there, that note, I mean, it was all right, it just wasn't the same as everything else. You see, it just wasn't right, so I had to pull it out, and the same thing happened over here. There's that same note, and it's just the wrong note. There we go. So that ended up being the finished and final track. So what happens next? Well, I mixed down my track and I sent it off, and that's gone, and I can do nothing more with it. It's going to be mastered by DivKid himself, I believe, which is exciting, and it will come out in, I've no idea, a couple of months, I guess, when they release the CD. The other three tracks I've also mixed down, and I'm going to make them available in some format, in some way, I think. For now, if you're a patron of mine, you can listen to them straight away. I'm going to upload them for you special people who support me financially. So if you'd like to listen to those tracks, if you'd like to hear what it was that I came up with, then join us on Patreon, join our little Molten Modular club. The fourth track though, the one that I've submitted to Law and Order Records, I'm going to keep that. I'm not going to release that in any other form because I think it needs to be released with the CD. So if you want to hear that one, you're going to have to pick up a copy of the CD when it's released. After that, then who knows, it might appear in some other form. And certainly what this has encouraged me to do is to make more music and to start doing something with that. So there you go, that's my take on how to write a track on Eurorack. I mean, that's going to change. The way I work will change as I go. It's constantly changing. I do, in many ways, hope to get to the position where I can just do a stereo recording and release that as a track. I really quite like that idea. I don't want to get bogged down in having to do it on the computer, although at the moment, with the gear that I have, with the rack that I have, I can't quite pull off the performance that I want. I don't have enough mixing facilities, enough muting, bringing things in and out, or necessarily all the effects that I want to use. But in time, I imagine I'm going to get to those sorts of things. Also, it's certainly true that keeping 8 channels wired in through my audio fuse and then into my surface for recording 8 channels simultaneously, it's a bit of a faff. To have that done, have that wired in all the time is annoying and not ideal, not conducive to just hitting record and recording stuff as I go. So ultimately, heading for that stereo mix is really, I guess, what I want. But for now, I hope that was interesting or helpful as this journey continues and continues to evolve. Coming up next will be my review of the Vermona randomRHYTHM, followed up by probably the Synths Graphic VCO. At that point, I might have to start looking at the Her mod. I don't know, but there's lots more goodies to come, and in the meantime, go and make some tunes.